What's up, guys? Hope you're doing well so far. Let's cut straight to the chase. Deltarune chapters 3 and 4 severely narrowed down the candidates for the Roaring Knight. Given the Knight's appearance with antlers, a trait only found in the Holiday family, most have taken one of three sides in the Knight discussion: Carol Holiday, December Holiday, or Rudy Holiday. Now, I suppose that one could argue that Noelle is the Knight, but I actually haven't seen anyone doing so, and I think it'd be a pretty hard case to make, so I won't be talking about her in this video. But if you have solid evidence for Noelle being the Knight, let me know in the comments and I'd love to hear it. But for today's video, I want to discuss each of these Knight candidates, the points for and against them, and then offer a set of evidence that I have yet to see discussed. A set of evidence that finally resolves some unanswered questions about Spamton and Des from as early as Chapter 2, and may change the way that you see the Knight mystery forever. Before we get into that, be sure to like the video. If you are a new or returning viewer who has not yet subscribed, please do so. It helps me out a lot, and it's greatly appreciated. Also consider joining the Discord server. I have the link in the description and also in the channel bio. Thanks! Let's get this out of the way. I do believe that Des is the Knight, and I hope that my brand new interpretation of some of Spamton's dialogue and actions from Chapter 2 helps you see why. But I do want to discuss some of the reasoning behind Carol Knight and Rudy Knight, since both have a decently solid foundation for being true, and I wouldn't be too surprised if they were. So if you want to skip past my analysis of Carol and Rudy, then use the chapters or timestamps in the description to do so. However, I highly suggest that you watch all the way because my thoughts on Carol and Rudy give some important context for my thoughts on Des. The first candidate that I want to talk about is Carol. The mayor of Hometown is easily the candidate with the most evidence in her favor. Most of this evidence comes from Chapter 4, where she is first introduced. Her convenient arrival to stop Susie from reading the code on Des's guitar after her phone call with Chris, her strange obsession with heart-shaped objects, and her suspicious line of dialogue seemingly directed at the player itself that has spawned many memes all point to her being the Knight. She is clearly an antagonistic force who is at least working with Chris, just like the Knight is. And as the mayor, she would easily have the means to be the one directing the whole Dark Fountain operation. Heck, she even has multiple katanas, including a black one, just like the Knight. There's even a hidden scene in which Asdor, who seems to be working for her, is revealed to have a black shard too, just like the one that breaks off the Knight's sword. There's more evidence too, I'm sure, but you see the picture by now. Carol is the most obvious contender for the Knight. But ironically, this is where I start to find Carol Knight to be less believable. Before chapters 3 and 4, I found Carol to be one of the more likely candidates. She was set up as intimidating and mysterious and would, once again, have the means as the mayor of Hometown, and would also have the motive to do so, considering what we theorize happened to Des. I also thought that her paralleling Asdor in Undertale as being the head of the family that the game focuses on, and the leader of her people, trying to fulfill an evil goal for a good cause would be great storytelling. However, after Chapter 4, my faith in this theory has actually gone down, funnily enough. It all seems too convenient. The Knight is revealed in Chapter 3 to have antlers. Then, minutes later in Chapter 4, we are shown a brand new character with the same spiky antlers and a bunch of obvious tells towards her being the Knight. Toby knows what kind of people play his games. Insane theorists who analyze every detail. But despite knowing this and including a bunch of obvious tells towards Carol being the Knight, he continues to tease us and keep the Knight a mystery through interactions like Chris refusing to think about the Knight or refusing to open the church door. This, to me, indicates that Carol being the Knight may be another classic red herring by Tricky Tony, similar to the ends of Chapters 1 and 2. Even those scenes had some truth to them. Chris isn't an evil human committing your genocides, but they are plotting against us. And Chris isn't the Knight, but they are working with the Knight still. Similarly, I think that Carol is not the Knight, but is orchestrating the Dark Fountains and whatever they are meant to accomplish alongside the Knight, Chris, Asdor, and maybe others in Hometown. Now, before I finish talking about Carol Knight and move on to Rudy Knight, I do have one more practical piece of evidence against Carol being the Knight. I don't think it's possible for Carol to have made the fountain in the church. We see her enter her home just before Chris and Susie leave, and the fountain is already made at the church by the time that we get there. Maybe she simply made the fountain before rushing to the house to take the guitar? Well, that would make sense if the Knight was not already inside the Chapter 4 Dark World by the time that we get there. So unless Carol can teleport, which I guess is possible given the Knight's powers, I think we can rule her out for being the Knight itself. She is clearly working with the Knight and Chris, but I don't think that she can be the Knight for the aforementioned reasons. Now, on to what I consider to be the more oddball, out-there Knight theory, Rudy Knight. This one admittedly has far less evidence than Carol Knight, and has far more working against it, but I still find it to be the more compelling one of the two, just for the fact that it's not as obvious. There are a few pieces of evidence for Rudy being the Knight. One of the major ones is the possible connections between how the Knight behaves during the fight against them in Chapter 3, and Rudy's illness. Some suggest that the flavor text during the fight and Chris's coughing after no-hitting the battle may be referencing Rudy's symptoms. There's also the theory that the Knight's abnormal ribcage may also be in reference to Rudy's illness. Others suggest that Rudy's illness is because taking the form of the Knight in the Dark Worlds is so physically taxing that it leaves him hospitalized. As far as motives go, a dying man really has nothing to lose, especially if it comes to trying to save his daughter, and he and his wife would be in cahoots to accomplish his purpose. I'm a fan of the goofy dad being the villain instead of the strict mother twist. I've seen other points brought up too, and I do encourage you all to at least look into this theory a bit more. Generally, however, I feel like most of the points in favor of Rudy being the Knight can be chalked up to coincidence or downright disproven. Firstly, I doubt that Rudy being the Knight is the cause of his illness because the first time that we see him outside the hospital is at the church the morning after the events of Chapter 3. If being the Knight was so taxing, you'd think that a battle with the Fun Gang and Undyne would render him too ill to attend the service. Instead, he seems healthiest at church and far worse afterwards, almost like it was simply the act of going to church that made him exhausted. I also don't think that he could have made the church Dark World just like Carol. He was in the hospital after the service and wouldn't have the time or the means to get to the church to make the fountain, especially not in his condition. And no, I don't think that he's faking his illness. He seems too genuine to do that, and if he were the Knight, Toby having this be the case would feel a little cheap in my opinion. How would Rudy even get out of the hospital to make the fountains? There's staff there at all times, even at night since Birdley gets admitted at night on the Weird Route, and there aren't any windows to escape from. You could argue that Carol uses her authority as the mayor to check him out of the hospital, or that the staff is also in on the plan, but that seems like a bit of a stretch. Rudy Knight is a cool theory, but it has too much working against it. Not to mention that I think it'd be cool for the main villain to be female this time around. That's not really evidence either way, but more of a reason that I preferred one of the other candidates over Rudy. One of the biggest things working against both Carol and Rudy to me is that the Knight doesn't seem anything like an ordinary lightner. The way it can shapeshift, his strange chest cavity, the way that it drips and laughs like an amalgamate. These things tell me the Knight is a lightner with special abilities and properties in the Dark World. Special abilities that come from something that would be more obvious if we got to look at them. Carol and Rudy look too ordinary to be this thing, especially when we know that another antlered creature went missing, possibly in a place associated with Winggaster and Dark Fountains. A place that could turn them into something horrifying. I am, of course, referring to my final candidate and the main topic of today's video, December Holiday. Even if I couldn't find any counter evidence to Rudy and Carol Knight, I still believe that Des is the Knight simply for the fact that she has the most evidence in her favor. You've probably seen most of it numerous times by now on your own playthroughs and in various places on the internet. But I'll do a quick rundown and then get to the point of today's video, how Spamton proves that Des is the Knight. Firstly, out of the three candidates, Des has been the best integrated into the story and the Dark Worlds up to this point. In my opinion, the best writing for a mystery like Who is the Knight will lay out clues early on in the story and slowly build. Unlike Carol, who appears suddenly in Chapter 4 and has all of her evidence dropped at once, Des has been consistently present since Chapter 2, and her relevance and evidence have been slowly growing with each chapter with well-integrated clues. In Chapter 2, her name appears as a puzzle, and the moon appears as a baseball, among other things. In Chapter 3, there are many references to her. We see her silhouette, hear her name at least once, perform a song that is implied to be one that she liked, enter a code that spells 1225, or Christmas, a literal December holiday, which is also likely the shelter code. So much of Chapter 3 subtly or directly integrates Des. Chapter 3 is also the chapter in which the Knight is introduced. Of course, Des is present a lot in Chapter 4 as well, considering that we get to see her room and interact with a lot of her personal belongings. In fact, we see some posters in her room that tie her to the Knight, as well as some stars that correlate with the star element the Knight is implied to be associated with. There's also the fact that the Knight seems to wield a baseball bat at the start of the fight and potentially transforms into a baseball. The Knight's weird amalgamate-like appearance could also be attributed to someone like Des, who we know went missing, likely in the shelter with Winggaster. Finally, there are also musical cues that suggest that Des is the Knight, such as the Lost Girl motif being introduced as early as Chapter 2 and being used very often in Chapters 3 and 4, including potentially the Knight fight song Black Knife, which, I mean, it goes without saying just how telling that is. Another interesting musical motif that I have not seen mentioned anywhere on the internet is found in the Chapter 4 tracks 12 AM and 13 AM. I would argue that the melody in 12 AM strangely resembles Snowden, at least slightly. However, 13 AM is different. It's the Lost Girl motif that is associated with Des. 12 AM is a representation of nighttime, at the darkest hour. But what if it could be darker than dark? While 13 AM might not actually exist, it symbolizes a deeper night and more devastating darkness than previously thought possible. The fact that this song features Des's motif indicates to me that Des is associated with the darkness and is the one responsible for it. The Roaring Knight. I also think that Des, both narratively and practically, makes the most sense to be the Knight. She is the only holiday unaccounted for, and her association with the shelter would explain the Knight's odd, animalistic, amalgamate-like appearance and behavior. I think that Des being the result of an experiment similar to the ones in Undertale's True Lab would be a great parallel. A monster, possibly fallen down or already dusted, brought back to life through determination. The determination needed to make dark fountains. And like Flowey, even though she was brought back to life, she did not regain her soul. Instead, her soul remains trapped in the code, which is the voice that we can hear there in each chapter. If this was the case, we would have a great parallel of Undertale, with the main villain being set up as Carol, who parallels Asdor for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, but the true twist villain being the soulless reincarnation of the fake-out villain's child, a reincarnation brought back to life in a dark, twisted lab using the power of determination. But now for the part that you've been waiting for. What does Spamton have to do with the Des? And how does he prove that Des is the Knight? Well, I want to reconsider and recontextualize some mostly unexplained moments involving Spamton. More precisely, his association with phones and the Big Shot lyrics, if you can even call them that. We know that Spamton has a history with phones. He became a big shot by talking to a strange person on the phone, and he went insane shortly after when the strange person stopped talking to him. I'd like to suggest that the person on the phone was not Wingasser, but actually the Knight. And I say this because King kind of suggests that the person who drove Jevil mad was the Knight by claiming that Jevil spoke to the Knight directly. It would follow that the Knight also drove Spamton insane for whatever motives they have through their conversations on the phone. With this in mind, consider the Spamton neophyte. One of the lyrics of the song Big Shot is, "It pulls the strings and makes them ring." This line always confused me. What could this possibly be describing? And then it hit me. This line is describing a guitar, an instrument which you pull the strings and make them ring. An instrument that is associated most strongly with December holiday. Not to mention that this connection between Des and guitars was first formed in the Spamton sweepstakes, so this line has a double meaning. It's referring to Des, who pulls the strings by playing the guitar, but also how the Knight pulls the strings and orchestrating the Dark Worlds, potentially by making the phones ring. This one line has convinced me that Des has to be the Knight. What else explains the phrasing? Furthermore, I always assume that this entity that pulls the strings and makes them ring is the same one that drove Spamton mad, and also the same one that calls him during the fight. Which leads me to my final connection. The Knight is not only Des, the one who literally and metaphorically pulls the strings. It's not only the person over the phone that called Spamton to drive him insane, but it's also the one that attacks Spamton over the phone during the fight. I always found it odd when Spamton answers the phone and says, "It's for me?" that he gets attacked afterwards. What if the Knight attacked Spamton in an attempt to help Chris? We know from Chapter 4 that one of the priorities of Chris, Carol, and the Knight is to preserve the soul inside of Chris's body. We also know that Spamton wants to take the soul for himself. The Knight, Des, stepped in using her typical means of contacting Spamton, the phone, in order to aid Chris in the fight and prevent the soul from being taken. If the Knight, Des, is truly the one pulling Spamton's strings and controlling the Dark Worlds, it also solves some other questions regarding Spamton's shop dialogue. One of the most mysterious lines of dialogue to come out of Chapter 2 is when Spamton mentions communion, and then starts to talk about the Knight before being interrupted and apologizing profusely. I think it's likely that the Knight cut off Spamton here, as to not reveal the location of the church's Dark World to the player. This would explain the association with communion, and additionally, Spamton does not know that he'd be leaking information to the player, since he believes that taking the soul results in freedom. If he knew of the player, he would not believe this. I think it's also possible that the Knight is responsible for the hyperlink block that often appears in Spamton's dialogue. Des, the one who pulls the strings and makes them ring, is trying to prevent intel from being leaked to the player by Spamton. So, that's my new set of evidence towards Des Knight that I have yet to see on the internet. What do you think? I'd love to hear any other evidence for the other candidates in the comments as well, so let me know your theories. With that in mind, thanks for watching the video. If you made it this far in the video, then you must like the video, so why not like the video and subscribe? Also, a big shout out to these lovely folks on Ko-Fi, Patreon, and YouTube, as well as a big shout out to our Fruit Salad members, Luke and Hufflepuff Prefect, and our Crazy Juice member, Tybee. I love you all. Be safe, be smart, don't be stupid, and have a great rest of your day.